A quick note before we start the show today, folks. I'm in the process of creating a relationship retreat for listeners, and I would love your feedback about what would make such a retreat valuable for you. So if you've got a second, please do me the kindness of filling out a short survey. I think it'll take you less than 4 minutes, and I put a link to it in our show notes. I certainly appreciate it. And now on to the show.
As a girl growing up in this culture, I would hear women say things like, oh, if my husband looked at porn, I'd divorce him. Or pornography would be the worst thing that could ever happen to my marriage. Or even in one instance, heard of a woman saying, I'd rather my husband beat me physically than look at porn.
I'm Eric Newton, and this is Together, the podcast where we explore the truth about human relationships. As a divorce lawyer, I saw thousands of couples break up firsthand. These days, I'm not so interested in breaking couples up, nor in keeping them together. I'm interested in what our relationships can teach us about ourselves and the world that we live in. So on this show, we have honest conversations with real people about real relationships. Today's episode kicks off the first of several stories that I'm posting on the topic of pornography. The first two are from Christian couples who have very different views from one another about porn. And the two episodes after that are from professionals in the porn industry, and their views are, well, a little more predictable. Today we're hearing from Nate and Angeline. Nate is the founder of a website and a podcast about marriage called first7years.com, and he's also done a lovely TEDx talk on the topic of love. And he and Angeline are both lifelong Mormons. They were both raised to believe that porn was inherently evil. They have a very different view about it now, but I'll let them tell that story. What's instructive to me about this interview is not so much Angeline or Nate's views on porn or sexuality, though those are interesting, but the realization that slowly becomes clear as these two discuss this topic, that meaning itself is fluid and subjective. These two experienced a paradigm shift that caused a very real uptick in the quality of their marriage, but their states of mind before and after that paradigm shift existed as ideas only. These viewpoints of theirs, whatever you may think of them, are purely conceptual. And the fact that a single idea can change the quality of an entire relationship is fascinating. But before I give away too much of their story, let's go to our interview with Nate and Angeline. You have some ideas about pornography that I think are probably unusual for Mormons and Christians. Is that also fair to say?
Yeah.
That is fair to say.
That's probably pretty fair.
Okay, give me the breakdown of your story around porn and how you see it.
In our church, a lot of us are taught since we're, young that we're not supposed to masturbate. We're not supposed to indulge in anything that would arouse our sexual desires outside of the confines of marriage. But then once you're married, sex is celebrated and it's encouraged, and you should do it a lot with your spouse. So there's this kind of no, then go mentality.
Right.
And so as I'm growing up, it's oh my gosh, my body's changing. I've got all these desires. I think women are awesome, and I'm curious, and also there's the anxieties that come with growing up and the loneliness that you feel when sometimes you're left out of things. And I was just never really given a way to deal with all of that in a healthy way. And so the easy thing was just to secretly look at pornography, and use it kind of as a way to self-medicate and even to learn or explore my curiosity, or explore things that I was curious about. And I looked at porn pretty regularly, probably through, I would guess that it started in my late teens, and then I looked at it through my early to mid 20s. And a lot of times it was actually not a lot of times. It was always accompanied with a huge amount of shame because it was something that I knew I quote unquote shouldn't be doing. And I just always felt so, I was like, am I addicted? Am I like ruined? Or if anyone finds out that I have this struggle, are they going to not love me? Are they going to be scared of me because they, is this like going to be this big warning sign, this red flag that's like, oh, he's undateable because he's looked at porn throughout his life. So it was something that I still struggle with it a little bit, like the shame aspect of it. But
you still struggle with that.
The shame, yeah. I still am scared to like talk openly about the fact that I looked at porn.
Says the guy who's doing it on a podcast.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Brene Brown says that shame needs three things to survive. It needs a secret, silence, and judgment. And one of the best ways to break through that shame cycle is to just get rid of the silence and speak out about it. And even though it makes me like honestly really anxious, even right now talking about it, I know that as I talk about it, it's getting rid of the shame. And that there are other people out there who are listening to this, hopefully, that are going, oh, okay, I'm not alone and it's okay. And I can have this amazing marriage and be a good guy and still have this kind of moral struggle inside of me.
Essentially, my upbringing was very similar to Nate's, very conservative, very religious.
Hearing all sorts of stories about how pornography has destroyed marriages.
Right. Like, as a girl growing up in this culture, I would hear women say things like, oh, if my husband looked at porn, I'd divorce him immediately. Or pornography would be the worst thing that could ever happen to my marriage. Or even in one instance, heard of a woman saying, I'd rather my husband beat me physically than look at porn. And so to me, someone who had never looked at porn or experienced porn, I was terrified of it because I had seen in my culture how much it had apparently torn apart all these marriages. And so I grew up just saying that's never going to be a part of my life. I'm not going to date anyone who looks at porn. I'm not going to marry anyone who looks at porn. And for a long time, I avoided any guy who admitted that he looked at porn. To me, that was a deal breaker. Eventually, I dated someone who I really liked, not Nate yet, who admitted to me that he looked at porn, and I started wondering, well, this guy's so great. Like, is porn really that bad? Is it really that big of a deal?
Right. And
then once I met Nate and hearing his experiences with it and falling in love with Nate and realizing that I didn't feel, when he was sharing with me his experiences with porn, I wasn't experiencing the same devastation that other women in my culture were experiencing. And it started opening a dialogue between us, and we were able to be a little more open and verbal about it to get to where we are right now.
During that phase, did you ever actually go and look at some?
So personally, I have never looked at porn myself. And so I think another thing that was hard for me is I had this perception of what I thought porn was. Like whenever I heard the word pornography, I assumed it meant something like super dirty, super graphic, super not tasteful. One day I just asked him, Nate, what kind of porn do you look at? And he opened up and shared with me the porn that he looked at. And I was just kind of like, really?
It's easy to assume you know what's going on in your partner's life without asking any questions, and assume that it's the worst case scenario, and assume that your partner's situation is just like every other horrible situation that you've heard about growing up, or from your neighbors, or from your family. And I think it's worth having a conversation about, because a lot of times I think what people get upset about when it comes to porn, or when they find their partner looking at porn, is they make a whole bunch of assumptions about what the pornography consumption means about them. Like, oh, it means I'm unattractive, or it means I'm not good in bed, or it means he wants to be with another woman, or it means that he doesn't have any respect for me, or like the promises that he made for our wedding. It can mean a million different things, but without ever asking those questions, you're working 100% off of assumptions, and you can't have a constructive, positive conversation about, or a healing conversation, without having the actual facts and like really understanding what's going on in your partner's world.
So does Nate still consume porn nowadays?
On occasion, a little bit.
Okay. And when he does that, do you have an automatic reaction?
Initially, I did. When we were first married and this would first come up, initially my initial reaction would be kind of hurt.
Yeah.
That he would look at that, just because we had discussed that we didn't want that to be a part of our marriage.
Oh, you guys did sort of have a rule at the beginning.
Before we were married, we discussed that we didn't want that to be a part of our marriage. So initially I would feel hurt, but once we started talking about it more openly, I like to compare it to Voldemort in Harry Potter. They always refer to Voldemort as he who must not be named. They wouldn't talk about him because they were afraid of him. And it's the same with pornography in our culture, in the culture that we grew up in. Nobody will talk about it. And the less they talk about it, the more power they give it and the more they fear it.
Amen.
And so that's kind of where we were at.
And so what happened when you did start to talk about it? What was the shift like experientially?
It just started to become a normal part of our conversations, and the anxiety around it started to go away. It started becoming normal. And eventually I just decided, this really isn't that big of a deal.
And was that, I mean, that decision is, I'm just wondering where it was sourced, because I agree, right? I agree it's just not a big deal unless you make it a big deal.
Exactly.
And there's magic in that fact. There's like the magic of the quality of our experience as humans is that we actually, in the end, get to decide if it's good or bad. And then the universe follows that decision, making that decision with integrity, like so that it's actually real in our bodies and not just some, affirmation that doesn't have depth, is a trick. And I'm trying to understand what was
how I came to that conclusion.
Yeah, like how did you actually shift over?
Good question. And so I feel like the argument around porn in our culture was so much focused on the man and what the man was doing, and less about controlling yourself. And so it's more like the victim mentality in my mind. And I recognized that I was allowing Nate's actions to determine my emotions. And once I realized that I was being a victim, I decided that I didn't want to be a victim.
I love that so much. Now, okay, so that's great, but let me test the edges, because you could apply that theory to anything.
Exactly. Yes.
Infidelity, for example.
Yep.
Which, a lot of couples on my show do. They're non-monogamous. And it shifts. It's no longer infidelity. I'm guessing you probably haven't gone there in your marriage. You guys are probably monogamous, right?
We are monogamous, but we've had a similar conversation where, like, in non-monogamous couples, often it's, in my experience with non-monogamous couples, the key is open, honest communication.
Right.
Like, you need to be honest about your partners. You need to be honest about your interests. You need to be honest about like where you're at, what you want, and be highly communicative. And then there needs to be an agreement within the relationship about this is the way that we all choose to move forward. If one person's like needs or desires are going unmet or unlistened to, the relationship structure breaks down. So we've had to make agreements inside of our relationship around the topic of pornography and what's acceptable and what's not. And like, that is a fluid conversation that is changing. And the agreement that we have right now is that if I want to look at porn, all I have to do is just let Angelin know I'm going to look at it before I do it.
Okay, cool. And as a footnote, it is all about the rules. I mean, it's just about the agreements that you have, and then that's where trust comes from, and good. But I'm still trying to understand for Angelin where the line is. So it's okay to look at porn as long as you guys do it within this particular structure, which is kind of a nice one, by the way, because then it makes Angelin part of it in a sense.
Right.
But also you do have a line around monogamy. So if you can apply that concept to pornography, why not apply it to sex with other people?
That's a difficult question. That brings up a lot of emotions inside me.
I think it's a value thing. I think that the way that one of the agreements that we talked about before we got married, and kind of it was an assumed agreement and something that we talked about and something that we also included in our marriage ceremony, was a commitment of monogamy.
I mean, clearly it's about values, right? Values are sort of the container that we use to define who we are, right? It's what we stand for, what we consider okay, what our boundaries are. It's an identity-oriented concept, and it's a useful one for interacting in society. And of course, that's got to be the foundation of your marriage. And also, of course, they change. You know, you're just going to have different values 10 years into your marriage than you do at the beginning. So, so of course we have to have flexibility in the agreements that we have in our relationships. Duh, we're humans. But I'm still fascinated about the magic of these transition points, because this was a deep one. You know, this was one that both of you had been raised with your entire lives, and it's still difficult to talk about. And yet
we're still in the midst of it.
And you're still in the midst of it. And yet you did make, I mean, the shift that you've already made to the agreement that you already have is huge. And it's ongoing. So I'm really curious. I'm still trying to understand from Angelin's perspective. Well, I'm curious from her perspective how it shifts. And something you just said, Angelin, was that when I asked you that question about infidelity, a lot of emotions came up. What were they? Were they relevant to what were they?
I don't know. I just think that infidelity is something that we haven't desired quite yet. I mean, I can't at this moment imagine Nate wanting to be with somebody else.
Yeah.
And again, that comes back to my own insecurities. What does that mean about me if Nate wants to be with somebody else? And so it's just something that we haven't confronted yet, because it's something that we haven't been to yet.
That's why I love this, because I think it's the same question. I mean, to be clear, it is, right? I mean, I'm not suggesting that you guys should be non-monogamous. I'm monogamous, and I'm happily monogamous. And
3 cheers for monogamy.
3 cheers for monogamy, and 3 cheers for polyamory. Like
yes,
I'm
also, yeah.
I'm a huge advocate of people doing what you guys are doing, which is self-defining, you know, your own value standards. But it's the same question, because the problem with pornography, really, fundamentally, I think you said, was that it was an attack on you.
Right.
And the same thing would be the case with infidelity or non-monogamy. But let's be honest. Nate's a human being. Of course he's attracted to people who walk down the street who aren't you.
Right.
I mean,
as am I. I mean,
As are
what?
you. Right? I mean,
We haven't discussed this.
we have.
right? Of course he's attracted to them. So does his inevitable human physiological attraction for other humans trigger you?
Right now, no. It doesn't. But I think it's because we have made this monogamous agreement that I don't think that him looking at another woman and being attracted to another woman means that he loves me any less.
Right.
So that's where I'm at right now, pushing it for him to actually go be with another woman. Now that I haven't quite arrived there yet.
But now turning back to pornography, what's the difference? How are you able to make the shift? Because that was an agreement too at the beginning. Mm-hmm. And then it also touches on the same issue. So how are you able to make the shift to make pornography be okay? And you can't make this shift. What's the difference? What's the qualitative difference?
I think this is a very good, profound question. Let me repeat the question back to you and you tell me if I got it.
That's a good idea.
You're asking me how I arrived at the conclusion that of our agreement and became okay with pornography when before I wasn't. What else am I missing?
And then step 2 is, how is that different from another concept that's similar, but that you haven't shifted your opinion around?
It isn't different. I think I just haven't quite experienced it yet, but I'm open to experiencing it later. Because that goes back to the growth factor.
Yeah.
I feel like this whole situation around pornography in the beginning was not comfortable because it was something I had never experienced before. But I feel like I've grown a lot just as a human from the experience. So I'm open to growing even more if another opportunity would arise. If that makes sense.
Now that I think is profound. Yeah. It's I think it's really hard for us to acknowledge that all of these things, all of these values, while useful and while we want them, are arbitrary in some sense.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I just finished reading a book by David Schnarch called Passionate Marriage. I don't know
so good.
If you've read it.
He is so good.
Awesome. I love his ideas, but this conversation reminds me a lot about that, about how marriage is a human growth machine and how in our relationships, it puts pressure on us in ways that we would never put pressure on ourselves and forces us to confront, like we get put in these two choice dilemmas where it's like with regards to this conversation, it's like, okay, Nate's either going to look at porn or not look at porn. And I'm either going to react this way or I'm going to react this way. Like we get put in these positions where it's like we're put in a position where we can grow or where we can resist the growth and avoid the hard conversation and still feel miserable. So we have the hard conversation and it's miserable, or we avoid the hard conversation and we're miserable. And I think that the mindset that we're trying to adopt, regardless of the hard conversation, is that we always lean towards having the hard conversation and seeing what is on the other side to push us to grow. So we didn't have sex before we got married. We had quite a few, probably more conversations about sex than most people from our faith before we got married. And one thing that has been really interesting is just learning to navigate asking for what we want and learning to navigate the balance between selfishness and selflessness, learning to navigate learning our bodies, like our own bodies, and then learning our bodies in the context of our partner and how we like sex. And it's created in some cases in a lot of cases a lot of joy and a lot of fun, and then in some cases it's also created a high pressure environment where it's been a little scary. Like, I know our religion is fairly patriarchal in nature, and I am one of those people. I'm a guy who kind of likes to fight against the patriarchy, if that makes sense. I don't want to be like a domineering, chauvinistic husband. Not saying that like Mormon men are all domineering and chauvinistic, but I wanted to avoid that appearance at all costs with my wife. I want my wife to be an equal partner. And so for a long time, I really struggled, and I still sometimes struggle with being really assertive and asking for what I want in bed. I always kind of want her to be taken care of, and it's presented challenges for us. And so sometimes that's kind of oftentimes what would push me to look at porn, is I was just like, oh man, I can't be assertive with my wife, but with porn, I can be as assertive as I want. And I don't have to worry about like hurting anybody's feelings.
Right.
I can just like have my outlet, and it's fine.
Can I ask you a specific sexual question?
Of course.
Whether or not I answer is another story, but of course, we're an open book. Yeah, go ahead.
Did you ever sexualize the shame that you had around looking at pornography?
Did I sexualize the shame? Tell me what you mean about that.
Something he would seek out?
Yeah. What a lot of the research around sexual development is that during adolescence, any kind of shame or pain from childhood gets sexualized as a way to process it into adulthood, which is where some sexual proclivities and some sexual fetishes come from. And, one of the pieces of work in adulthood, in a relationship or alone, is to really dig down into where our sexual desires arise from, and as a way of to learn about ourselves. And so I'm curious because you were saying the shame was a big deal.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if you sexualized it.
Probably in some way.
I would say yes. We've talked about this.
Yeah. Like there's a part of me that I think part of what I'm attracted to about the pornography is the fact that it's forbidden.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Like there's a like, you're not supposed to be doing this thing that really that I enjoy about it. Like, oh, this is forbidden. It's not supposed to happen. You shouldn't be doing this. It's a secret. And that's turned into part of the attraction of pornography. And with Angeline, like, she loves sex.
Mm-hmm, I do.
And so there's not really a time where I feel like it's like forbidden. It's always accessible, and she's always pretty willing, and I'm really fortunate in that regard.
Though it takes out the forbiddenness,
but it does remove that indulgence that I get out of the pornography consumption. So it's interesting that you bring that up.
Well, right, because what Stan Siegel, for example, the author of Your Brain on Sex, who does a lot of work around unearthing where the shame is rooted, or where what got sexualized in adolescence. Mm-hmm. What he would say is the only antidote to something sexual that's holding you back is to go through it, not around it.
Ooh.
And
well, there's a new challenge for us,
right? So you've got to get really intimate with your partner, get deep into what the thing is that you don't want to say, and explore it fully sexually. And so I'm curious if you're feeling incompletely sexually satisfied because you can't get the forbidden fruit, is there something that you can do in your relationship to create that forbidden?
Man, this is turning into an awesome therapy session. Probably. That's a conversation we'll have to have. But there's probably stuff that we could talk about to explore that, and yeah, that could definitely open up some doors for us, I'm sure.
So if somebody hasn't thought about that question specifically, like, am I unfulfilled in a particular sexual way?
Mm-hmm.
Then the words won't be present. Like, you don't know the answer. Like,
right.
I've always wanted him to do X, and it's not like that for you because you've never thought it out. But
right.
There's this, it's almost like a blank spot in one's experience of sex. There's like these spots where your eyes just skip over it. You know, like you're looking at the landscape of a thing, and you know, you just happen to not pay attention to this one little area. And what I've found over and over is that that's the area where the value is to be found. You're skipping over it. People tend to skip over that area unconsciously because it's a little scary, or it doesn't seem like it's a good idea to go there, and maybe we should best avoid this. But the truth is, you're in a safe relationship. It's the perfect opportunity to look there and to see everything. So I'm wondering, and again, you don't have to answer this, do you have any areas like that?
I probably do. And like you said, I haven't thought about it very much. Coming into marriage, I think from my perspective, growing up in the culture that we grew up in, where it was very no, 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 that's something that a part of me that I tried to kind of shove away a little bit. So now that we're married, I'm trying to kind of wake it up again.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Absolutely,
and so I'm trying to learn about my own body and what I like in my own body. And that in and of itself has been kind of a journey that I've been going on. But I would actually really love to think about that question and think about what areas I'm glazing over unconsciously.
Seems to me like you guys are doing a lot of really important and unusual work, particularly in your culture. But the how, so everybody says you've got to do the work in relationships, or you've got to communicate, or you've got to understand your sexuality if you want your relationship to be fulfilled, you know, but nobody actually knows how to do that. Have you got thoughts on how a woman in your situation who's been taught by her culture to say no to sex for so long now is supposed to turn towards it?
Well, to get personal, a lot of it has to do, like I said before, is exploring your own body and being okay with exploring your own body. Because before, I mean, when we get married in this culture, we just assume that the man knows what he's doing because we've been taught, oh, men are sexual beings and we're responsible to keep them at bay. But in that time, we never take the chance to explore our own sexuality. And that puts a lot of pressure on the man. So I think a lot of it has to do with getting comfortable with yourself first.
That's
whether that includes masturbation or not, and giving yourself permission to feel pleasure on your own first, and then incorporating that with your partner. Because if you can't give yourself permission just to be a sexual being individually, you're keeping so much from your partner in that regards.
Yeah, that makes so much sense.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's that makes sense. Just being present to your own experience first.
Mm-hmm.
I wasn't intending to go here, but as you were talking, I thought to myself, well, the answer that has been the answer since the 80s has been, probably even before that, look at porn.
Uh-huh.
I mean, it's too tiny. It seems like I should have meant to get us here.
Circle.
Right. Well, and honestly, like, that isn't something I've quite closed the door to.
I emailed Angeline after our interview in anticipation of my interview with next week's couple. And I asked her whether she thinks that she has a duty to protect her husband from activities that she believes to be harmful. And here's how she responded in email. She said, "Good question. I definitely agree with that idea. We should be helping our partners avoid things that are harmful to them. But in the case of porn, this mindset would be assuming that everyone thinks pornography is harmful, which they don't. To be honest, I feel like reacting the way I see a lot of women in my culture react is way more harmful to their husbands than the porn itself. Getting angry, stonewalling, setting ultimatums, blaming all their problems on their partner, calling them addicts out of context, etc. It perpetuates the problem instead of making it better. It sets them up for failure instead of success. For the sake of the argument, let's say that pornography really is harmful. Even if that were the case, I would still feel the same way. In the cases where pornography is harmful, it's more a symptom of a greater issue than the actual problem itself. I think all the focus on pornography is preventing people from dealing with what's really going on. I couldn't agree more, Angelin. Thanks for that email. Well, that's it for our interview with Angelin and Nate. If you'd like to learn more about these two, you can find them at their website, first7years.com. That's FIRST7years.com, and I'll put a link to that in our show notes. Be sure to tune in next week for more on the topic of